Good morning guys, and welcome to this edition of Hikelopedia. Today you find me in Hsinchu County's Youluo Shan. Occasionally, when hiking Taiwan's trails and forest roads, you come across historic artifacts that you're not quite sure of what they are or what they were used for. Take these ceramic insulators for example. Previously, I posited that maybe they were used to provide power for workers in Taiwan's logging industry. However, sometimes the truth turns out to be something completely different, and occasionally something very shocking. This brings me back to an episode from a few weeks ago during a hike in New Taipei's Shimen, when I happened across a memorial talking about the Aiyong Xian, or Aiyong line. One of the commenters on that video said how his grandfather used to tell him not to cross the stone boundaries in the mountain or he would lose his head. Now naturally, that sparked my curiosity. Although I'd heard about this line in the past and the historic boundaries between the Chinese and indigenous populations, I didn't really know that much about it. So once again, I found myself trawling English and Chinese online history sources for the story of the Aiyong Xian. The Aiyong Xian were a network of trails and roads that ran along rivers and through the forests and mountains of Taiwan that acted as de facto boundaries between the Han Chinese and later Japanese controlled areas of the island and those inhabited by its indigenous population. A quick backgrounder on Taiwan's history. Just a few hundred years ago, Taiwan was inhabited largely by indigenous peoples. For hundreds of years they had traded with local groups such as the Chinese and the Japanese, and later with Europeans as they visited the island. Eventually, some of these foreign traders, eyeing up Taiwan's fertile land and abundant natural resources, decided to try and colonize the island. The Spanish and the Dutch tried first in the early 1600s, lasting just a few decades between them. Then, mass migration from across the Taiwan Strait began, a process that saw the island's Chinese population increase exponentially, from just a few thousand in the mid-1600s to around 2 million by the turn of the 19th century. Naturally, the arrival of so many people from across the strait put pressure on the original custodians of Taiwan's land, especially along the fertile western plains. Unable to stem the flow of settlers, some indigenous groups compromised and struck deals, renting or selling land to the Han while gradually resettling further and further eastwards towards Taiwan's mountainous interior. Other native groups decided to stay put, living and intermarrying with their newly arrived neighbours. A few indigenous groups, however, remained extremely hostile to the Han, viewing them as colonisers, stealing their land, their hunting grounds and their natural resources. Taiwan's tribes were warrior people and headhunters by tradition, so from time to time they would attack and kill settlers they deemed to be encroaching beyond the boundaries of their designated territory, taking heads as prizes. This eventually led the Chinese authorities to establish a de facto boundary between the civilized and non-civilized areas of Taiwan, which the Han population was prohibited from crossing. This early boundary was known as the Tunio border and can be seen on many early maps of Taiwan. However, it wasn't just the Chinese immigrants settled along the western plains that were attacked. As the world modernized and maritime traffic increased, the notoriously rough seas and bad weather around Taiwan resulted in countless shipwrecks along the island's rocky shoreline. Often, these bedraggled survivors, relieved at making it ashore, were attacked by indigenous peoples who showed them little mercy, viewing these strange-looking souls emerging from the water as mortal enemies. One of the more well-documented incidents from this period was the 1867 slaughter of 14 American citizens from a ship called the Rover after it was wrecked off Taiwan's southern tip. Another example was the killing of 54 sailors from Ryukyu in 1871 after they too were shipwrecked off the coast of present-day Pingdong. These latter killings proved to be a pivotal point in Taiwan's history as they led to a punitive mission by Japan into indigenous territory in the south of the island 3 years later. And this foray was later to have severe consequences for the island's indigenous people. The Japanese mission and the Qing's realization post-settlement that it had little to no sway over large parts of Taiwan led the authorities to try and bolster its control over the indigenous regions. The Qing launched a campaign to bring large parts of the island previously left to their own devices under Qing control, abolishing the previous boundaries that had demarcated Chinese and indigenous territories, leaving Han settlers free to push ever westwards in search of more land and natural resources. In 1875, the Batongguan Traverse Trail was established as the Qing pushed into previously uncharted mountainous areas and beyond. As Han settlers encroached on land that had previously been off limits, this predictably led to increased conflict with the indigenous population. To protect these pioneers, fortified pathways and roads were forged into the mountains. These were known as Aiyong Xian, Ai meaning narrow pass and Yong meaning brave. These pathways were staffed by Aiyong volunteers, more often than not from the Hakka community. It was their job to man the lines and prevent disgruntled indigenous people from attacking those they deemed to be encroaching on their territory. This led to several campaigns which were in effect small wars being fought between Han militia and various indigenous groups towards the tail end of Qing rule of the island. And as is quite common following a transfer of power, the Japanese basically continued using the same methods of control upon assuming sovereignty of Taiwan in 1895. These efforts were then stepped up by the colonial government following the Nanjang Incident of 1902, the first of several indigenous uprisings against Japanese rule. Following the putting down of the rebellion, the Aiyong system was expanded, with indigenous areas basically encircled so that economic activity such as camphor harvesting and logging could be increased. Within a few years, Aiyong lines ran through the mountainous regions of almost all of Taiwan's present-day administrative regions, including New Taipei, Taoyuan, Hsinchu, Miaoli, Taichung, Nantou, Yilan, Hualien, Taidong and Kaohsiung, encircling many of Taiwan's indigenous groups. The Atayal, Siddiq, Taroko, Bunan, Sasaya and Ami were all affected by these ever-growing lines of control. And they weren't just pathways with police stations and blockhouses. Many stretches of the line were electrified, using power from localised hydroelectric or oil-fired power stations. And if that wasn't enough, some stretches of the line were even laid with landmines. Yes, landmines. This discovery shocked me at first, but when you think back to the behaviour of various colonial powers around the world, including the British, it shouldn't really have come as a surprise at all. Anyway, at their peak in 1904, the Aiyong lines reached a total length of approximately 573 kilometres, decreasing to 545 kilometres by 1909. As time passed, the cumulative length of the lines began decreasing as the areas that needed encircling also shrank. So that is why conductors like these can still be found in places like this in Hsinchu County. They are a sign of locations that used to feature electrified fences that made up part of the Aiyong Xian. So my initial instinct that these things were used to provide power for workers stationed up here in the forests for economic activity was not completely incorrect. It's just that the power was being used in a much more sinister manner. It was basically part of an historic system designed to keep Taiwan's indigenous people out of their traditional homelands while they were ravaged by colonial economic activity. As I said at the beginning, history is often fascinating, but at the same time frequently shocking. The Aiyong line system wasn't the only method used though, as Taiwan's Japanese masters also employed a range of other tactics when it came to pacifying the island's indigenous population. One of these tactics included encouraging adventurous Japanese nationals to move into indigenous areas, cohabit with and marry into the tribes. Once trust was gained, these Japanese pioneers would often work to manipulate and convince the tribes to bend to the will of the colonial government, which wanted to stamp out tribal customs and move the indigenous people down from the mountains into regions where they would be easier to control, and at the same time giving the Japanese access to the natural resources. If that didn't work and the tribes resisted, then Tokyo's aims were usually achieved using other means, namely violence through overwhelming military force, which included plane-dropped bombs, artillery, and sometimes even poison gas. Some of these tactics are documented in the excellent book Kondo the Barbarian by Paul D. Barclay. Based on official Japanese records, it provides a detailed account of the life of one of these pioneers, Kondo Katsusuburo, as well as a detailed look into the tactics employed by Tokyo around the time of another indigenous uprising against colonial rule, the 1930 Wushi incident. It is a valuable insight into life and politics in indigenous areas during the Japanese colonial era, and a must-read for anyone who is interested in this period. In addition, there are relics of the Aiyong Xian to be found all over Taiwan, such as here in Datong Township, Yilan, where there is a short walking trail that was once part of a line. It's a great place to come and get a feel of what things used to be like, while also learning a bit more about the history of the line as you walk the trail. Alright guys, that is it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed today's walk and talk around Youluo Shan in Hsinchu. Also, hope you enjoyed the brief history of the Aiyong Xian. Of course, there's a lot more information available about that story, so if you're interested in it, then you can have a look online. And as usual, my disclaimer: I'm not a professional historian. I just do this because I enjoy reading about history and trying to simplify it and present it to people who may not know things about it. So if I do make mistakes, I apologize. I try my best. And that's it. If you enjoyed the video, then please don't forget to give me a like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications. If you want to help support the channel, then you can always click thanks down below. Buy me a coffee, I could do with one today, and consider becoming a channel member. And that's it for another video. See you next week. In the meantime, take it easy. Over and out.
Shimen 来。